I think a lot of the conversation about labeling in AI, sometimes revolves around a misunderstanding of what the law actually requires right now, right? I mean, one of the interesting things about, and I love the way Andrew was framing it, but one of the interesting ways that advertising frames product demonstration issues right now is actually from a Supreme Court case back decades ago. And the way that the Supreme Court framed it was not just the consumers, come guys, come up, I'm just talking. Not that only the consumers were misled by the claims themselves, but were consumers, were the production techniques relevant themselves? Were the production techniques relevant, right? Because if you're asking a consumer to believe their own eyes about something, and in fact, what they think they're seeing is not really what they're seeing, then that in and of itself is deceptive, right? So even if you communicate truthful information to consumers, but you communicate it to them in a way that's misleading, that in and of itself can be false advertising. And so I think that there isn't a principle right now that allows you to mislead consumers through product demonstrations. Emphasis on mislead. Anyway, that's a whole much longer conversation, but we're here to talk about something else, so maybe we can talk a little bit about that in a way. So, thank you for being here. Thank you for sticking with us to the end of this. And I've got with me Jess, Mustafa, and Perry. Perry's from the advertising agency Reuter Finn. Mustafa's from LinkedIn, and Jess is from Uber. And what we're going to try to do is bring it down a little bit, or bring it home, and sort of say, we've been talking about these ethical standards. We've been talking about some of these big principles and what they mean and the impact on consumers. And now let's actually talk about how you put them into action. How do you really take ethical standards and sort of fit them into what companies are doing for their advertising? So I think that it would be helpful to actually just spend a second and talk about how you define ethical standards. When a company is thinking, when a brand is thinking about creating advertising from an ethical point of view, what are you thinking of when you hear ethical standards? Jess, you want to start that off?
Sure. So it's not just who the brand is, it's what actions they take out in the world. So it's actually ours on our website. If you look up Uber Values, there's a website on it. It is core to not just, again, who you are when you work there, but every action you take publicly, every action you take internally. It's a shared belief system and ethical shared value system.
So it's like as a shared and expressed ethical value system.
Yeah.
I know, Mustafa, how do you?
So yeah, no, for us, so a company tends to have like a whole slew of core values. But I personally, what resonates to me is like when they're very practical. And like what I wanted to mention is like, so LinkedIn's one of its core values is that we're always going to be member first. And that really helps frame how I think about it as a lawyer as well. And it's not like everything we do, whether it's like publicly or internally, as a member of LinkedIn myself, I'm somebody who used LinkedIn way before I worked there. I think like, well, what would the members want to see? How would the members want to see like LinkedIn behave in any certain action? And if you like keep that in mind, to me that is just so practical. Because again, I'm a user. I don't want the company to go in a path that would like impact me as like a user of the company. As a lawyer, I think that's like a guiding principle that like is so practical and works on a daily basis.
And then Perry, you're coming at it, I think you're being exposed to it from two perspectives.
Correct.
One, you've got a global ad agency or global PR agency that is operating around the world and thinking about these issues in all these different ways, but you're also getting these pushed down to you from clients as well. So do those two things, do an agency's ethical standards in terms of the way that it is creating materials versus the ethical standards being communicated from brands, are those different or are they the same?
There's overlap for sure, but as you said, we're global, so you have to consider regions, ethics, their principles and their values when creating marketing campaigns. If we're creating something in Southeast Pacific or South Pacific, it's going to be much different than a North America campaign. But the key principle we look for is truthfulness and transparency, but also preserving that positive reputation, not only for our agency, but for our clients. That's sort of a key tenet that we stand by.
So I'm glad you brought up sort of truthfulness, because I think that we should talk about for a second, where do ethical standards fit in to legal standards? Do you see there being a difference between ethical standards and legal standards?
Absolutely. I mean, again, there is overlap, but I think people have said this before, but legal is basically the floor and ethics are the ceiling. So even though something can be legally correct, it may not be ethically right to do so. We may have certain rights from an influencer, where we can do this huge global throw their face on the billboard, and we'd have the legal right to do that, but ethically we would never do that because it's just taking advantage of someone that you probably paid them very little for such a broad campaign.
Jess, what are you thinking here?
So I'm thinking that I agree with you that I think this was spoken about in the last panel about legal being a floor and ethics being a ceiling. I think it's a little bit more complicated than that, and I think that it kind of depends who you are, so and what you're selling and what you're doing, right? I mean, I think that, for example, in Puerto Rico, you cannot advertise, or maybe this was a previous law that was struck down, but you can't advertise casinos even though gambling is legal. Now, is that ethical? Is that legal? I think if any of you are in the alcohol business in this room, yes, some nods here, like those alcohol advertising laws are completely antiquated and based on 1930s principles, and they're actually not about overconsumption in all cases. They're not about advertising to kids. They're just about this moral paternalism. So some might say, no, they're absolutely needed. We should go back to 1930. Wherever you are, some laws go further, but I would agree that the vast majority of laws, don't do enough. But I just think it's nuanced sometimes.
Well, I think that's there's a little debate happening right now. John is probably thinking about this and interested in this, but one of the questions of when you think about recycled content in products is how you calculate the recycled content that you've got on a product, totally. Particularly in a complicated supply chain where you might get the recycled content delivered in January and then you get it delivered again in November, but in between you may need some more material, and so you're looking at more of a mass balancing approach or some sort of approach where you're looking at it over the course of the year as opposed to actually measuring the amount of recycled content that's in any individual product, right? And the FTC, in the last time it revised its green guides, which was a long time ago, its guidance about the kinds of practices that would violate Section 5, basically said, look, we're okay with this rough kind of mass balancing approach because, it's not so relevant to consumers really that their individual product, how much recycled content's in the product, if the company overall is assuming that on average that product has that much recycled content. And that was kind of the legal principle that the FTC expressed. The National Advertising Division, which is the advertising industry's main self-regulation arm that hears disputes in the advertising industry, just came out with a case basically diverging from that point of view and basically saying, I'm not sure a consumer is really thinking about it in terms of an annual perspective, but they're actually thinking, is this product that I'm holding in my hand, does that in fact have 95% recycled content? And so I do think that there's this interesting tension between the ethical standards, the legal standards, and I'm not actually sure who's got the right answer there, right? And I think that another interesting thing that I saw is in the UK, the Advertising Standards Authority has also really been struggling with this idea of should it be aligned with legal standards or should it be asking companies to do more, right? And so I think that this question of are they in conflict, and if they're in conflict a little bit, how do you make a decision, right? Do you follow the law? Do you follow what you think is right? I don't know, Mustafa, how do you figure out what the...
I think I kind of mentioned in the beginning, but you have to think like what are the company's goals and aspirations as well. So yes, the law is again the floor, but then the secondary question is what are the company's core values? So no surprise for LinkedIn, it's because we're a professional network, we are going to have things that go beyond what the law is. So for example, on the platform, in your example, we don't even allow alcohol because of that. And so I think it's a multi-layer approach. Of course, it's what is the law, but then it's, how does company want to be viewed in the world? And what are we going to allow and not allow based on that reputation?
And, when we're trying to think about this how you apply these standards, it also feels like it's a moving target. I mean, maybe it feels like more of a moving target in the last year or so than it has in the past. But, if ethical standards are shifting, right? And of course, who gets to define what ethical standards are, right? There can be the people in this room that, or the people that agree with you that think about what ethical standards are. There can be sort of the larger discourse about what ethical standards are. But as ethical standards are changing, like, how does this impact the way that companies think about what does it mean for there to be ethical standards? I don't know, Perry, how are you reacting to what's going on in the world about changes in standards?
It's difficult because as general counsel, I can only opine on the legal pieces to a certain extent. So it's like, this is what the law says, you're allowed to do this, but there's a balancing act of, like, we're talking about ethics here, but it's not only just legal, but it's also reputational. So we do represent a lot of foreign clients, and there is a federal statute, FARA, the Foreign Agent Registration Act, that we have to comply with in certain instances, and everything's made available to the public. All of our communications with reporters, our contract with the client. And under the current administration, that may be weaponized now. So it's like we have to be very cognizant of if there's a certain client in a certain country that goes against the grain of this administration, do we want to be in the crosshairs? And I can just only flag that, and then leadership will make that call. So for me, it's sort of, I just flag what I can see and say, look, there may be some sensitivity if you're representing insert country or insert company. Just something to consider when you evaluate whether or not you want to engage.
Well, but even to take it out of maybe in a way that feels very controversial, if you look at the sort of the way the FTC thought about disclosure standards over the last 4 or 8 years, there was really a shift in terms of what that FTC believed was an effective disclosure for consumers, right? They really sort of said clear and conspicuous. If that's the standard, in order for disclosure to be effective in advertising, it has to be clear and conspicuous, right? And so, but the way in which those standards were applied and expressed kind of got tougher over the last 8 years. And so the question are they expressing, they're sort of saying, well, we've decided that the law means something else right now. We've decided that the law means something else right now. But, how does that impact what we think actually consumers need, and how do we apply that to what a company decides to do?
Yeah, this is for me.
Yeah.
I think it really goes back to what are those core company values. I mean, I think first of all, I'm speaking as myself and not Uber. I think that's a clear disclosure. But I think that it's about what is the thrust of the law, like what is the undergirding point of the law? What are we trying to protect? We're trying to protect the consumer from not understanding what they're getting. And so are we following that? And does that also line up with our values, our mission, who we are, and our relationship with our consumers? So in some ways, there's an embrace of stricter standards, and in some ways is that going to make a difference if at the end of the day, what we're telling our consumers is disclosed, transparent, and make sense for them. So
just sticking with you for a second, though. So I want to talk now about sort of like the way in which ethical standards at companies are expressed. Yeah. So you started to talk a little bit about that. So can you talk a little bit about what the way that Uber expresses its code or its ethics?
Sure. So I'll talk about the larger company values, but there's also advertising values. We have a targeting policy that really encapsulates our ethical standards, as well as legal and brand standards and policy and comm standards and fairness standards for how we approach third-party advertising on our platform. But I'll just, first parts first, our Uber values, they are hashtagged, they are used everywhere, from the CEO down, company meetings, performance reviews, how we think of each other, how we evaluate performance, how we ask for help from our managers and from our peers. Like, one of our values is great minds don't think alike. It's actually my favorite. And the idea is that it's in hiring as well. The way we approach conflict, great minds do not think alike, meaning conflict in a room is a positive, right? It means that people who think differently have a lot to share, and so that permeates throughout the whole company. And of course it permeates into our advertising, how we speak publicly, how we talk to our shareholders, what they expect from us, right? But then also there's other ethical standards, I guess, throughout. So there's, as I mentioned, advertising standards. It's our advertising targeting policy. When we first became an advertising platform, we had to come up with a brand new idea for what was our ethical code, really, or what was our policy for what we would do with our data. And there was groups from fairness, algorithmic fairness, comms, policy, legal, brand, marketing, sales, all in the room together thinking about, well, what do other people do? What's the law? Who are we? Why do people come here? And what do we want as a group? And that's how it came together.
Mustafa, how does LinkedIn Express?
Very similar. We actually created our ad policy in the same way you described. I think of it in two ways, and the company thinks of it in two ways. So there's the ad policy, and then there's like the professional community guidelines as well, which is like how we expect everyone to behave on LinkedIn, and all of that is published. It's Googleable, and so that the professional community guidelines are essentially how we expect members to behave professionally and in a trustworthy way. And we actually report on that on an annual really basis based on like how much content has been violated, how much fraud have we caught. So we keep ourselves honest, and we keep like the world honest by first publishing that, and second like checking on it and making it transparent, like our findings on how everyone essentially has behaved on LinkedIn.
Well, it's interesting. You're both advertisers.
Yes.
And you're both advertising platforms.
Yes, we are both, and I am speaking on both. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So is there a difference between the sort of the standards you apply to yourself as a, hey Google, we want you to run this ad about this, but we're not accepting that on our platform? Like, how do you think of the standards? How do you think of the standards that you apply to your own advertising versus, what you're making available to the community?
Yeah, no, I think they're one and the same. I've never seen the two in conflict, honestly. And again, it's like a company that's fairly conservative in that. And so, like, yes, what we won't allow on the platform is certainly not how we would present ourselves in the world as well. Yeah.
So I'm not going to say it's different, but I will say that we're actually going through this process right now about thinking about our internal targeting policy. And I think when people come to the Uber platform, they have a different expectation about what they're going to get from Uber versus what they're going to get from a random car commercial, right? And so that relationship with third-party advertisers just is by nature different. And so there is a different conversation internally about what meets consumers' expectations. What do you come to Uber for? And so that's by nature a different experience. It doesn't mean that we have different ethical standards. It just means we have that conversation internally differently.
Well, we used to,